Before Britain ruled seas, built railways across colonies, and filled maps with red, there were footsteps. The footsteps of settlers. Farmers, soldiers, traders, convicts, missionaries, and families who crossed oceans in wooden ships to begin new lives in distant lands. They did not just travel. They changed landscapes, societies, and identities. They carried British laws, language, religion, and customs into territories that already had their own. This is the story of Britannia's overseas settlers, who they were, why they left, and how their journeys shaped the world. Hello and welcome. I hope you are doing well today. Thank you for being here as we explore one of the most important chapters of British imperial history. Today, we look at the ordinary people who became settlers. Men and women who left Britain and built new lives across North America, Australia, Africa, and the Pacific. Some left for opportunity. Some left for survival. Some left by force. And some left dreaming of a better life. Before we begin, here is a question for you. Do you think Britannia's overseas settlers were driven more by personal ambition or by the empire's desire for expansion? Between 1600 and 1700, the first waves of British settlement crossed the Atlantic and began to take root in North America. At the beginning of this century, Britain was not yet an imperial superpower. Its presence overseas was uncertain, experimental, and fragile. Yet each ship that left its shores carried people who believed that a different life might be waiting on the other side of the ocean. These journeys marked the earliest foundations of what would become a vast colonial world. The Atlantic crossing was long and unpredictable. Travelers spent weeks at sea, surrounded by water that stretched into the horizon. Supplies were rationed. Storms battered small wooden ships. Hope pushed them forward. Some passengers dreamed of new land and personal fortune. Others sought refuge from religious conflict and state authority. Their motivations differed, but they shared a willingness to risk the unknown. It was a beginning. When these settlers reached the shores of North America, they stepped into a world that was already inhabited, governed, and understood by indigenous peoples. Nations with deep histories lived on the land long before European maps redefined it. Languages, alliances, trade routes, and traditions were well established. The arrival of British settlers did not bring civilization to an empty space. It brought new pressures to societies that already existed. From the beginning, contact meant change. Settlements emerged first in places like Virginia, New England, and Newfoundland. They built houses from local timber. They learned new planting techniques. And struggled through winters that were harsher than those at home. Some settlements nearly failed. Others survived because indigenous communities provided knowledge of crops, climate, and geography. Without this assistance, the earliest colonies might not have endured. Cooperation and conflict existed side by side, forming a relationship defined by tension and necessity. In Virginia, land and profit drove ambition. Tobacco cultivation became a source of wealth, pulling more settlers westward. This growth demanded space, and with it came pressure on territories already occupied. Boundaries were drawn and redrawn, often without regard for the people who lived along them. Settlers wrote letters back to Britain describing opportunity, but those letters rarely acknowledged the consequences for those displaced by expansion. The story of prosperity hid the cost that prosperity required. In New England, religion shaped settlement. Communities formed around shared beliefs and strict expectations for daily life. Colonists imagined their towns as places of moral purpose. They saw their journey as guided by conviction rather than ambition. Yet even here, the presence of settlers reshaped the land. Fields expanded. Forests were cleared. Agreements with indigenous nations were negotiated, tested, and sometimes broken. Ideals and reality collided as communities tried to balance principle with survival. Further north, in Newfoundland and coastal territories, fishing stations and trading posts connected Britain to Atlantic commerce. These were not farming settlements or religious experiments. They were economic footholds. Men arrived seasonally to fish, process, and trade. The land became a point of exchange rather than a place to build new towns. Indigenous peoples adapted to this shifting economic landscape, forming trade relationships while navigating the changes imposed by foreign arrival. Throughout the century, the presence of settlers expanded. More ships arrived. More towns took shape. Trade networks strengthened. For many settlers, the process felt like progress. For indigenous communities, it meant negotiating a world where autonomy was challenged in ways not experienced before. Diplomatic relationships were tested as both sides tried to navigate unfamiliar demands. The arrival of colonists did not produce a single outcome. It produced many cooperation, resistance, adaptation, and loss. Back in Britain, news of the colonies spread slowly. Stories of survival, land, and trade reached ports and coffeehouses. They fueled imagination and ambition. The public learned of new settlements through fragments of information, often filtered through the voices of those who benefited from expansion. North America became part of the national imagination long before it became part of the national system. The idea of a British world overseas began here, not in the certainty of empire but in the uncertainty of settlement. By the late 17th century, these early colonies formed a chain along the Atlantic coast. They were still dependent on Britain for goods, support, and recognition. But they had begun to develop their own identities. The people who lived there no longer felt entirely British, yet they did not see themselves as separate either. They lived in a space between identities, shaped by distance and by the land itself. This tension laid the groundwork for future generations and future conflicts. Looking at the first waves of settlement reveals that this era was not just travel. It was transformation. The ocean crossing transformed the lives of those who left Britain. The arrival of settlers transformed the societies that were already established in North America. Land that once held indigenous nations alone now held competing claims. Relationships that once defined regions now included foreign powers. The world became interconnected, not by agreement, but by consequence. The century did not end with clarity or order. The seeds planted in this era would grow into something larger than anyone on those first ships could have imagined. The presence of Britain in North America began as a fragile experiment. It became a system of colonies. Later, it would become the foundation for conflicts and alliances that reshaped both continents. Between 1600 and 1700, the first waves of settlement carried more than passengers. They carried identities, assumptions, ambitions, and consequences. They carried the start of a history that would echo far beyond the shoreline where those ships first landed. Plantations and expansion 1700 to 1760. At the beginning of the 18th century, the British Empire changed from a network of trading posts into something rooted in the ground. Settlers who once imagined themselves as temporary guests in new territories began to stay. They cleared fields, built houses, and raised families. What had once been a distant commercial adventure became a lived experience. The empire no longer existed only on maps. It existed in footprints, fences, and farm tools. It existed in the quiet routines of work and the loud ambitions of expansion. Across the Caribbean and North America, plantations rose from cleared land. Sugar fields stretched toward the horizon in places once covered by dense forest. Tobacco farms expanded across fertile soil, with barns and storage buildings appearing like new landmarks in unfamiliar landscapes. Wheat and cotton grew in fields shaped by the seasons. Each plantation became a small world, tied to Britain by law, trade, and expectation. The soil connected to the empire as firmly as any treaty or naval route. Trading ports developed along the coastline where ships arrived heavy with manufactured goods and sailed away heavy with exports. These ports became gateways between continents. Sailors, merchants, and clerks moved along the docks, lifting crates and keeping records. That measured the value of labor and land. Warehouses filled with sugar, tobacco, timber, and hides. Local markets emerged to supply both settlers and traders. Over time, the ports became lifelines, keeping colonies connected to the heart of the empire. The demand for land pushed settlement farther inland. Families moved beyond coastal areas, cutting paths through forests and following river systems deeper into the interior. They sought fertile ground, hunting territories, and places to build new communities. Expansion was more than ambition. It was encouraged. British authorities viewed settlement as a tool to secure territory and resources. The more land occupied by British subjects, the more influence officials believed they held. Colonization became a strategy as much as a livelihood. Villages expanded into towns. Towns expanded into colonies. Meeting houses, markets, and courthouses appeared. Roads were built from necessity rather than planning. What began as scattered homesteads developed into societies with their own local identities. Children born in these colonies grew up with a mixed sense of belonging. They lived British lives in places that had never seen Britain. They carried accents shaped by distance. They learned customs that blended memory and adaptation. The empire was no longer only imported. It was built on site. The plantations that fueled this growth relied on systems that tied labor to profit. People worked the fields from early morning into dusk. They harvested crops, maintained equipment, and helped build the infrastructure that supported expansion. Their labor sustained households and markets. Some worked by contract or under agreement. Others worked without choice or freedom, forced into systems they could not leave. These realities existed alongside the narrative of opportunity, shaping the foundation on which expansion rested. Expansion reshaped the land itself. Forests fell to axes. Rivers became trade routes. Coastal marshes were drained to make room for fields and warehouses. Wildlife migrated or disappeared as settlement advanced. The transformation did not happen overnight. It happened acre by acre, decision by decision. The human footprint deepened each year. It was written in plowed soil and survey maps rather than declarations. The empire's presence was felt in law as well as landscape. Officials issued charters, appointed governors, and enforced trade rules that connected local life to decisions made across the ocean. They could form assemblies, but authority flowed from Britain. They could cultivate land, but trade followed the empire's direction. This situation created both security and tension. The colonies belonged to Britain, but they developed habits of self-management. Churches, schools, and taverns became centers of community. Children learned to read using books shipped from British presses. Sermons reminded congregations of their place in a wider world. Taverns echoed with voices debating rumors of conflict or opportunity. These institutions anchored colonial society, giving structure to a world still under construction. Life felt ordinary even when it was part of a global transformation. For those in Britain, news of expansion arrived in letters and trade reports. Articles described new plantations and profitable harvests. Maps shaded new regions under British control. To readers at home, these developments seemed like progress, proof that the empire was growing with purpose. They did not see the complexities that came with it. They did not hear the quiet uncertainties of settlers living far from everything familiar. The empire looked clearer on paper than it did on the ground. By 1760, the colonies no longer looked temporary. They had become rooted communities with futures of their own. Their economies, cultures, and expectations were no longer identical to those in Britain. They were shaped by place as much as heritage. The empire had gained territory measured not only in miles, but in lives lived within its boundaries. The transformation from visitor to resident, from settlement to society, had taken hold. The decades between 1700 and 1760 reveal how empire changed from a distant project into a physical presence. They show how fields, ports, and households shaped global power. They show how expansion was not just movement, but occupation. Land turned into livelihood. Livelihood turned into identity. The empire became something lived, not imagined. Plantations and expansion built the world Britain would inherit. They laid foundations that would define future conflicts and future ambitions. They turned geography into strategy and strategy into routine. It settled. It stayed. It became part of the earth beneath the feet of those who built it. After the 7 Years' War 1763. In 1763, the 7 Years' War came to an end, and the British Empire stood on the edge of transformation. The conflict had stretched across continents, from Europe to Asia to North America, and its conclusion remade the shape of imperial power. Britain emerged victorious over France, and that victory was not only recorded in treaties. It was written into the land itself. Maps changed. Borders shifted. Territories were traded like currency. In the aftermath, the empire stood larger and stronger than ever before, but also more ambitious and more complicated. The Treaty of Paris was the moment where the New World took shape. Canada became a British possession, its governance shifting from French administration to imperial authority. The war had proven that Britain could seize territory, outmaneuver rivals, and reshape the global landscape. But gaining land was only the beginning. The question that followed was what to do with it. In the years immediately after 1763, settlers began to move into newly acquired regions. Some came from older colonies along the Atlantic seaboard. Others arrived from Britain, carrying with them letters of introduction, small savings, or the hope of new beginnings. These settlers did not move only for personal opportunity. Their presence served a purpose. Settlement became a strategy. By placing British families, merchants, and officials in these lands, the empire could secure its claims more effectively than with soldiers alone. People became a political tool. Loyalists and merchants played an important role in this process. Many had supported the imperial cause during the war and now looked to the government for reward or direction. They established trading posts, opened warehouses, and connected coastal settlements to transatlantic networks. These commercial links ensured that the newly gained territories were tied into the imperial economy. In ports along the Atlantic, goods, news, and influence moved in and out like tides. The land was not only occupied. It was integrated. Former soldiers, too, became part of the imperial design. After the conflict, regiments disbanded. Men who had fought for the empire sought their place in the New World. Some accepted land grants as a form of payment. Others remained near forts and trading posts they had once protected. Their presence provided a kind of unofficial garrison. A civilian shield that reinforced British authority without requiring constant deployment of the army. They settled in the gaps between frontier and wilderness, becoming anchors of imperial presence. For indigenous nations, the end of the war brought new pressures. The balance of power that had once existed between European rivals changed. With France largely removed from the region, negotiations and alliances shifted. Britain now held control over territories where relationships, trade, and diplomacy had long been complex. Local populations understood that the new order would bring new expectations, and that settlement would not remain distant. Across river valleys and forest frontiers, conversations about land and sovereignty gained urgency. Back in Britain, news of the new territories inspired confidence. Newspapers presented the territorial gains as proof that Britain was destined to lead on the world stage. Merchants imagined profit flowing from these regions through trade in furs, timber, and agricultural goods. The empire had not only grown in size. It had grown in imagination. The belief that land meant power strengthened, and that belief guided decisions far beyond the map. Yet the expansion also carried challenges. Governing distant territories required administration, support, and infrastructure. It demanded funds, and after years of war, the British treasury was strained. Officials in London debated the responsibilities that came with control. The empire had won a prize, but it was a prize that demanded attention. Along the Atlantic coast, settlements expanded and changed the land around them. Forests were cleared for farms. Roads began as footpaths and widened into trade routes. River crossings turned into ferry points. Each change marked the quiet progress of imperial consolidation. It was not dramatic like battle. It was gradual, steady, and effective. These developments revealed a new style of imperial power. Where armies had won the land, settlers would hold it. As the decade unfolded, questions of identity took shape. Were these new territories an extension of Britain, or something different? Should they be governed as colonies or as partners? Should settlers see themselves as British citizens abroad or as something new? No clear answer emerged. In this uncertainty, future tensions began to form. But in 1763, those tensions were only shadows on the horizon. The British Empire believed it stood at its height. The defeat of France seemed to remove the greatest obstacle to expansion. More land meant more security. More resources meant more commerce. More settlers meant more permanence. The empire saw itself as a global force, directed from London but lived in distant fields, trading posts, and fortified towns. Confidence guided policy. Ambition guided movement. By the end of 1763, the world looked different than it had before the war. The British Empire held Canada. The Atlantic coast teemed with new arrivals. Merchants prepared for trade. Former soldiers built homes. Maps showed red where once they had shown blue. A belief settled into the imperial mindset. Territory does not need to be conquered again and again by force. It could be secured by presence. What began as victory became occupation. What began as occupation became settlement. And what began as settlement became strategy. The 7 Years' War had ended, but the consequences of its conclusion were only beginning to unfold. In 1763, the empire stood triumphant. It did not yet see the pressures and questions that would follow. For the moment, the land itself was the answer. More land meant more power. The story of Australia's early British identity begins in 1788, not with pioneers seeking new horizons, but with convict ships anchored in an unfamiliar bay. Their journey had taken months across unpredictable seas. On board were men and women sentenced under British law, some guilty of theft or fraud, others caught in a system where poverty itself could lead to conviction. They did not come searching for freedom. They came because the empire sent them. The settlement at Port Jackson, the place that would become Sydney, began as a rough encampment. Tents and timber structures rose along the shoreline. Dense bushland surrounded them. The climate challenged those who had never felt such heat. Supplies were limited. Rations were strict. The colony survived on discipline as much as on resources. Guards, officers, and prisoners existed side by side in a place that resembled more a worksite than a town. Britain had not planned for comfort. It had planned for relocation. Transportation to Australia became a system. Courtrooms in Britain sentenced convicts to years of exile. They boarded ships with no certainty of return. Many had committed crimes born out of hunger or desperation. The legal code of the time delivered harsh punishments for minor acts. To the authorities, relocation solved multiple problems. It removed those seen as burdens on society and established a distant presence for the empire. What happened to the people after arrival was secondary to the act of sending them. The work began immediately. Roads were cleared and built with hand tools. Farm plots were carved from ground that fought back with roots and stone. They made bricks, hauled timber, and raised foundations for settlements that would outlast them. Hobart, Sydney, and other towns that formed in the decades that followed carried traces of that labor in their earliest streets. The expansion of colonial presence relied on work that was commanded rather than chosen. Punishments existed within this system. But so did a narrow path to improvement. Good behavior could lead to tickets of leave. Allowing convicts to work for wages or build small opportunities. Some eventually gained freedom and remained. Becoming farmers, merchants, or skilled tradespeople. Over time, these former prisoners became part of the structure of the colony. They married, raised families, and helped shape the society that emerged from the harshness of the early settlement. The irony of the situation was clear. A land intended for exile became home. Ships continued to arrive for decades. The long chain of forced transport linked Britain to Australia between 1788 and 1868. Each vessel carried a mixture of stories. Some convicts had stolen food to survive. Others were sent for debt or forgery. A few had committed violent crimes. The system did not distinguish much between them. Once they boarded a transport ship, their individual histories were replaced by a shared fate. The ocean became the line between their previous lives and the new one waiting for them. The expansion of settlement reshaped the landscape, building a colonial framework. Streets replaced dirt tracks. Storehouses replaced supply tents. Administrative buildings rose where scattered shelters once stood. Farms spread outward into the interior, marking the growth of agricultural production. The colony survived, not through choice, but through necessity. Life in Britain continued to influence the settlement. New laws, new governors, and new demands from London shaped the colony's direction. Officials wanted results. They wanted usable land, exports, and order. For those living in Australia, this meant constant adjustment. They were part of an experiment in imperial administration, learning how to live in a place that had never been meant for them to choose. Meanwhile, the identity forming in Australia began to diverge from the identity of Britain. The distance between the two places created a shift in attitude. Life required resilience. It demanded adaptation. People developed a sense of place defined not by tradition, but by survival. The early settlements became communities built from necessity rather than heritage. Over time, the descendants of convicts and settlers would shape a culture distinct from the one that had sent them. In 1868, the era of transportation ended. The final ship carrying convicts arrived, closing an 80-year chapter. By then, the foundations of Australian society had changed. What began as a penal colony had grown into a place where free settlers, former convicts, and officials lived together. Towns had become cities. Roads reached beyond the coastline. A new identity had formed from forced beginnings. Australia's British identity did not start with ambition or exploration. It began with relocation, labor, and endurance. It began with people who did not choose their destination. Their story is a reminder that not all chapters of empire were written through confidence or power. Some were written through survival. By the end of this period, the colony had taken root. What had started as punishment had become permanence. Australia, shaped by decades of forced settlement, stood on the threshold of becoming something more than a distant extension of the empire. It had become a place where identity was no longer assigned, but slowly, quietly, created. Settlers and New Societies 1800 to 1830. Between 1800 and 1830, Britain lived through a moment of transformation. The Industrial Revolution rewrote the fabric of daily life. Cities swelled with new workers. Machines replaced manual labor. Farms changed as wages fell and landowners modernized their estates. For many, the familiar world seemed to shrink, even as Britannia's place on the global stage expanded. In this atmosphere of uncertainty and ambition, thousands of settlers looked to distant lands for new beginnings. They imagined fresh fields beyond crowded streets, new towns beyond factory smoke, and the chance to rebuild identity far from home. Canada, South Africa, and New Zealand emerged as destinations where opportunity seemed possible. Not certain, not guaranteed, but possible. Others gathered what little they had and trusted that distance itself would offer change. In Canada, settlers arrived to landscapes of forests, rivers, and vast expanses of farmland. Towns grew slowly, built around mills, trading posts, and wooden churches. British customs took root in soil that was not British. Streets were given familiar names. Markets sold goods with familiar prices. Institutions, from schools to courts, reflected the systems they had left behind. The settlers believed they were building something stable, something orderly, something recognizably theirs. They saw themselves as founders of new communities shaped by old traditions. South Africa attracted those searching for farming opportunities. Fields were carved from grasslands and valleys, shaped into homesteads that blended imported tools with unfamiliar environments. Settlers introduced crops, routines, and livestock that mirrored the world they had known. Life there demanded adaptation. The climate, the terrain, and the distance from Britain tested assumptions. Yet the settlers continued to build using the framework they carried in their minds. Houses rose with British floor plans. Town squares followed British design. Local governance borrowed from British authority. The new society was not a copy, but an echo. New Zealand offered a different challenge, a landscape both rugged and striking. Settlers encountered mountains, coastlines, and forests unlike anything at home. They arrived with ideas rather than clear plans. They constructed meeting halls and schools, determined to bring structure to unfamiliar surroundings. For some, it felt like a second chance at life. For others, it felt like an experiment shaped by hope more than certainty. Across all these destinations, settlers carried more than luggage. They carried cultural habits, language, professional skills, and expectations about order and community. They brought parliamentary ideals, Anglican traditions, and everyday customs that shaped how they farmed, built, traded, and taught their children. Newspapers printed abroad still referenced Britain, trying to make distant worlds feel connected. Even the simplest objects, from teacups to textbooks, served as reminders that the identity they knew had not been left behind. Some settlers believed they were building better versions of Britain. They imagined cities without overcrowding, fields without scarcity, and communities without the strict class limitations they had experienced at home. They saw themselves as architects of renewal, shaping futures with lessons learned from the past. These dreams fueled their determination. It helped them endure winter storms, crop failures, and long distance from family. Others believed they were escaping. They fled factory layoffs, rising rent, or debts accumulated through survival rather than mismanagement. They wanted fresh soil because the soil they came from no longer felt like their own. Their decision to leave was not ambition, but necessity. Their journey was not framed as triumph. It was framed as relief. They believed that somewhere across the sea, they could build a life not defined by hunger or exhaustion. Identity evolved as these communities grew. British customs blended with local conditions, creating hybrid societies neither fully British nor entirely separate. Festivals, food, clothing, and architecture changed as settlers adapted to climate and resource. Some traditions disappeared simply because they could not survive distance. Others strengthened because they anchored memory. In these settlements, identity became negotiation. It shifted with each passing year. Back in Britain, newspapers printed stories of these new settlements. They described wide open spaces, fertile land, and new markets. They spoke of opportunity as if it were guaranteed. They made distant lands feel closer than they were. They encouraged the belief that Britain was not shrinking during industrialization, but expanding through settlement. The world became both larger and smaller at once. For the settlers themselves, daily life did not feel like a story of destiny. It felt like labor, improvisation, and endurance. Roads needed clearing. Houses needed building. Crops needed planting. The future depended on each harvest, each storm, each negotiation with conditions that did not bend to expectation. The dream of a better Britain abroad required constant work to remain intact. By 1830, these societies had taken shape. They were not complete, but they were established. Their identities lived in the space between origin and adaptation. The settlers carried the rhythm of factory whistles or church bells. They carried both hope and doubt. And in their new homes, those memories became part of the foundation on which new worlds were built. Settlers did not only carry Britain outward. They carried Britain forward. They made the empire not just a political structure, but a lived experience. And in their efforts to rebuild their lives, they helped redefine what it meant to be British far from Britain itself. Between 1830 and 1870, the expansion of British settlement reached a decisive and turbulent phase. The idea of settlement as opportunity collided with the reality that people already lived on the lands being claimed. Where settlers expanded, conflict followed. Across multiple continents, frontier lines hardened into zones of confrontation. The British Empire moved not only with ships, treaties, and administrators, but with military force, legal pressure, and systems of control that reshaped entire societies. Settlement was not just movement. It was domination. In New Zealand, the arrival of British settlers intensified tensions with the embark Ori. Early agreements and negotiations raised hopes for shared coexistence, but land sales, disputed boundaries, and differing interpretations of authority quickly fractured that possibility. Between the 1840s and 1860s, a series of conflicts erupted as embark Ori leaders defended their land, autonomy, and authority. These wars were fought with determination on both sides. Settlers called for more troops. The empire responded with reinforcements. As the fighting spread, the balance shifted. The British military presence grew, and the embark Ori world faced pressure unlike anything it had known before. Conflict became a tool of control. And land became the measure of consequence. In South Africa, another story unfolded, equally shaped by competition and control. British settlers encountered the Dutch-descended Boers, whose communities had already established their own presence in the region. The meeting of these groups was not simple coexistence but a struggle over authority, space, and political direction. At the same time, African kingdoms and communities faced increasing pressure as both British and Boer settlers expanded into contested territories. Diplomatic negotiations turned into disputes. Disputes turned into campaigns. Local leaders confronted a world in which external powers imposed rules, borders, and expectations. The region became a patchwork of contested authority. Australia experienced its own version of this pattern. British settlement moved inland from coastal settlements into territories held by indigenous Australians for tens of thousands of years. Expansion did not unfold as a single event but as countless small acts of occupation. Surveys, fences, and farms advanced across landscapes that had shaped cultural knowledge for generations. Indigenous communities resisted in different ways, some through open confrontation, others through adaptation or negotiation. But the advance continued. The pressure of settlement forced cultural change, displacement, and the erosion of systems that had existed long before the empire imagined its presence there. In North America, the pattern was familiar but evolving. British influence intersected with the interests of other colonial powers. As indigenous nations navigated a political landscape reshaped by external ambition. Treaties were drawn, reinterpreted, and contested. Territorial disputes escalated as settlers pushed into lands that had originally been protected or recognized by earlier agreements. For indigenous communities, defending land meant defending identity, governance, and future generations. For settlers, land promised prosperity. The conflict between those visions defined the frontier. Throughout these regions, a shared logic guided imperial action. Settlement created the expectation of authority. Authority justified control. Control required systems to maintain it. Administrators arrived with policies. Surveyors redrew boundaries. Military units enforced decisions. Legal systems replaced local customs and governance structures. Schools, missions, and government offices introduced new expectations for how people should live. The process was not uniform, but its direction was clear. Power moved outward from imperial centers and settled onto the lands and lives of people who had not invited it. This era also revealed how narratives shaped perception. Reports sent back to Britain described expansion as inevitable, as progress, or as necessary for security. Conflicts were framed as misunderstandings or resistance to order. By the time these accounts reached the public, the complexity of these struggles was often lost. Violence became policy. Pressure became reform. Conquest became administration. The language softened the reality. For settlers, identity and conflict became intertwined. Many saw themselves as pioneers, building futures against hardship. They carried the belief that the land would reward determination and labor. But this belief depended on the removal or control of those who were already there. The frontier became a space built on contradiction, a place where hope and harm existed side by side. For indigenous peoples, these years demanded adaptation in every direction. Some communities formed alliances to navigate the new political order. Others resisted directly. Still others attempted negotiation in the hope that agreements would protect a portion of their land and rights. Yet even when treaties were signed, the expansion continued. Loss accumulated not only in territory but in the power to define decisions about that territory. Control shifted away, slowly at first and then with increasing speed. Conflict and control were not accidental outcomes of settlement. They were part of the structure that supported it. Behind every new farm, town, or port stood systems of authority designed to secure it. The empire understood that territory without control was temporary, and control without enforcement was fragile. So these years became a proving ground. A place to test how far the empire could extend its influence, and how firmly it could secure it. Looking back, 1830 to 1870 marks a turning point. Settlement moved from exploration to occupation. Contact moved from negotiation to enforcement. The frontier became a line of transformation, where land, culture, and autonomy were reshaped by expanding power. The consequences of these decades continued long after they ended. They remained in law, memory, borders, and identity. Conflict did not always end in battle. Sometimes it ended in silence, in the quiet pressure of new rules, in the erasure of old boundaries. But the impact was lasting. These years show that expansion was never just movement. It was a claim. A claim supported by systems designed to stay. In the story of empire, this era stands as a reminder. That history is shaped not only by where people go, but by what they demand when they arrive. Victorian ambition 1870 to 1901. In the final decades of the 19th century, the British Empire entered an age of confidence and expansion that reshaped its identity. Under Queen Victoria, the idea of settlement became more than movement. It became a symbol. Brochures spoke of prosperity waiting overseas. Newspapers praised pioneers as evidence of national strength. The empire was no longer imagined only through maps and trade routes. It was imagined through families ready to build new lives across the world. Steamships lined the docks of Liverpool, London, and Southampton. Their hulls gleamed beneath banners and advertisements promising opportunity. Families gathered with trunks, crates, and bundles of possessions, each packed with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Children held tightly to parents. Young couples imagined futures on distant fields. Retired soldiers, clerks, and laborers saw settlement as a chance to begin again. The gangplanks that led aboard felt like bridges between two worlds. Governments encouraged this movement with deliberate strategy. Land grants in Canada offered acres of forest and prairie to those willing to clear and cultivate. Settlements in Australia invited farmers, builders, and shopkeepers to turn open space into towns. Southern Africa drew prospectors and families who believed the empire could transform unfamiliar landscapes into familiar ones. These promises framed relocation as service. To settle was to strengthen the empire. To build a home was to build national destiny. For those who left, the journey itself reshaped identity. The horizon became a constant companion. Even without arrival, people felt changed. They no longer belonged only to the country they had left behind. They now belonged to a vision, one constructed from stories and assurances. Letters home would become proof of progress. Photographs would show children growing in places where their grandparents had never walked. But behind the images of optimism lay complexity. The land offered to settlers was not empty. It was already lived on, shaped, and understood by others. Expansion displaced communities and altered their futures without their consent. Where settlers saw open fields, others saw the loss of heritage and home. Where advertisements promised growth, local people experienced disruption. The benefits of Victorian ambition arrived unevenly. And the cost did not fall on those who advertised settlement as destiny. Still, in Britain, the image of the empire grew brighter. Newspapers printed stories of new towns rising from frontier landscapes. They described roads carved through forests, schools opening in remote settlements, and churches built as anchors for community. They described roads carved through forests, schools opening in remote settlements, and churches built as anchors for community. These accounts created a narrative of forward motion. They framed the empire as inevitable progress. They encouraged belief that British identity carried with it the right to expand. The Victorian imagination celebrated this expansion as virtue. Paintings showed settlers standing against dramatic skies, surveying future fields. Public lectures described scientific and agricultural improvements that would transform unfamiliar environments. Literature created characters who traveled, cultivated, and triumphed. In this narrative, the world beyond Britain existed to be shaped. Settlement became storytelling. Storytelling became justification. Steamship travel transformed the experience of relocation. Earlier voyages had required months of hardship. Now, new engines cut the time drastically. The ocean felt smaller. The empire felt closer. Ports that once seemed impossibly distant now appeared reachable. Distance no longer meant separation. It meant connection. This technological change accelerated movement and deepened Britannia's global presence. Even those who never traveled felt part of the transformation simply by reading about it or watching departing ships vanish beyond the harbor mouth. For many settlers, life after arrival was not what brochures had promised. Winters in Canada froze fields before crops could take root. Deserts and plains in Australia challenged farming knowledge developed for different climates. Southern Africa presented conflicts of land, language, and authority. The reality of settlement required adaptation, resilience, and negotiation. Hardship replaced the simplicity of the advertisements, but the empire's narrative did not always reflect that struggle. Instead, it highlighted success and minimized difficulty. At home, pride made the hardships invisible. Public celebrations and exhibitions praised settlers as proof that British character could flourish anywhere. Speeches linked expansion to national destiny. Maps shaded new territories as though they had always belonged. In classrooms, teachers framed settlement as progress. Students traced borders and absorbed the belief that Britannia's global presence was natural. Yet beneath this confidence, contradictions grew. As more settlers arrived overseas, voices of resistance and concern grew louder. Local populations pushed back against land seizures. Some British citizens began to question whether expansion aligned with the values they believed the empire represented. By the end of the century, the celebration of ambition had gained a shadow. The world was no longer as easily defined as the posters and pamphlets suggested. By 1901, when Queen Victoria's reign ended, the empire stood transformed. Settlement had redrawn maps, built cities, and created generations who identified with places far from Britain. Steamships had created new connections. Brochures had created new expectations. Families who boarded vessels decades earlier had built new societies, sometimes thriving, sometimes struggling, always changing. Their journeys had made the empire larger, but they had also made it more complicated. Victorian ambition shaped identity, pride, and imagination. It carried people across oceans and across the threshold of history. It promised beginnings, even when those beginnings came at the cost of others. It expanded Britain's global presence, even when that presence reshaped lives without consent. It proved that the empire had force, but it also proved that force came with consequence. This was the age when settlement became more than occupation. It became aspiration. It became proof of belief. And while the steamships carried families to new horizons, they carried the weight of ambition. And the legacy it would leave behind. Between 1880 and 1914, the scramble for Africa reshaped the continent. What began as competition between European powers for influence transformed into physical settlement, administration, and economic control. Territories once connected to Britain through trade and diplomacy became landscapes of migration, where farms, towns, mines, and railways appeared. With sudden, disruptive force. In these decades, settlement was not simply movement. It was strategy. British settlers arrived in regions such as Kenya, Rhodesia, and South Africa, with the expectation that they were stepping into a world of opportunity. Advertisements in newspapers described fertile land, mineral wealth, and new beginnings. Shipping companies promised safe passage. Colonial offices offered grants and incentives to those willing to build a life overseas. They saw themselves as pioneers of agriculture, industry, and governance. In these territories, laws and regulations increasingly favored newcomers. Land was surveyed, divided, and distributed with priority given to settlers who arrived with official approval or financial means. Farms were established on soil that had long been connected to local communities. Mines opened where minerals had been known for generations but were now claimed and managed by companies operating under imperial authority. These decisions reshaped the balance of daily life. Livelihoods that had existed before the arrival of settlers now faced new boundaries and new rules. Political power followed the pattern of land ownership. Local councils, regional assemblies, and administrative positions often reflected the interests of settlers first. Those with European status or education were given access to decision-making roles more readily than those whose families had lived in the region for centuries. Representation was uneven. Influence was uneven. The structures of administration tilted in one direction, creating a system where authority flowed away from the communities who had known the land longest. Economic control developed alongside these political changes. Settler farms exported crops to global markets. Mining companies extracted gold, diamonds, and other minerals for international trade. Ports and railways connected these resources to distant buyers. These networks strengthened the empire's economy, but the benefits were not shared equally. Settlers gained access to credit, infrastructure, and transportation systems. Local populations often faced restrictions, taxes, or labor requirements that shaped their options and limited their standing within the new order. In towns and growing cities, the contrast became visible. Settler neighborhoods expanded with shops, schools, and government offices. Meanwhile, many local families found themselves living under rules that separated them from the resources that had once been familiar. The physical landscape reflected the structure of colonial policy. Maps were redrawn not only to show borders, but to show ownership. By the start of the 20th century, this pattern had taken firm shape. Kenya saw the rise of large agricultural estates. In Rhodesia, mining towns developed around industry and export. In South Africa, the discoveries of gold and diamonds intensified settlement and administrative control. Each region had its own history, its own negotiations, and its own responses to change, but the direction of policy remained consistent. The empire expanded. Settlers established themselves. Equality did not. The presence of settlers also influenced identity. Those who arrived from Britain often viewed themselves as representatives of a modern world, bringing systems they believed were improvements. Schools, legal codes, and municipal structures reflected British models. At the same time, many local communities sought to maintain cultural continuity, adapting their traditions within the new frameworks or resisting changes to language, land, and authority. This created a world in which two systems existed side by side, but not on equal terms. Some settlers recognized the imbalance and questioned it. Others did not. Some local leaders negotiated to protect their communities within the new system. Others organized movements that would grow stronger in the 20th century. The years between 1880 and 1914 did not resolve these tensions. They set the stage for them. The scramble for Africa did not end when the borders on the map were finalized. It continued in offices, farms, schools, mines, and homes. As the First World War approached, the structure of settlement had firmly shaped daily life. Agricultural exports, mineral extraction, and administrative rule connected Africa more tightly to the empire than ever before. The British Empire gained territory, resources, and prestige from this expansion. But the benefits flowed unevenly. For many others, they represented disruption, limitation, and the beginning of struggles that would define the century to come. Between 1880 and 1914, the empire expanded outward, but its foundations shifted inward. Farms, mines, and towns became markers of a global system built on unequal footing. The scramble for Africa did not only change borders. It changed lives. The empire grew, but equality did not. From 1914 to 1945, two global wars reshaped the world and altered the meaning of settlement across the British Empire. Places that had once been imagined as distant extensions of Britain were pulled directly into the struggles of the 20th century. Men enlisted, ships mobilized, and supplies crossed oceans. Settlers and colonial subjects served in the same conflicts, but for many, the experience changed how they understood loyalty, identity, and the future. The world they returned to after the wars no longer resembled the one they had left behind. When World War I began, thousands of settlers volunteered or were recruited to fight. They marched in uniforms that carried the same insignia as soldiers from Britain. Some fought believing in unity and duty. Others enlisted because they wanted to prove that their homes deserved recognition and respect. On the battlefields, distance disappeared. Mud, trenches, artillery, and loss became a shared reality. The myth of separation between colony and homeland faded. Everyone was part of the same war. Returning home after the First War brought difficult questions. Settlers arrived to places that looked unchanged, but they themselves were different. Farms, towns, and territories were no longer remote edges of empire. They were communities shaped by sacrifice. Veterans expected acknowledgement and opportunity. The dream of independence was no longer abstract. It was a path that some could now imagine. The interwar years created tension between old systems and new expectations. The empire still existed, but it no longer felt timeless. Protests, petitions, and negotiations appeared in newspapers. Settler populations that once identified primarily with Britain now held layered identities. They were part of the empire, yet separate from it. They shared history, but not always the same future. For some, loyalty weakened. For others, loyalty remained but required new terms. The world was moving. Colonies and dominions could not stand still. Then, in 1939, another war began. Troops assembled from every corner of the empire. They crossed continents to fight in deserts, forests, islands, and ruined cities. Their journey was not only military. They fought to protect homes that had changed since the last war. They fought to defend worlds that were still trying to define themselves. As the war expanded, expectations changed again. People began to believe that sacrifice demanded transformation. If millions were willing to risk everything, then the world after the war could not return to old structures. Victory could not mean repetition. The pressure of global conflict collided with the weight of history. When the Second World War ended in 1945, the empire survived in name, but it had already begun to loosen. Returning soldiers carried a new sense of connection to their homeland, but also a new sense of distance from imperial authority. Independence movements gained strength. Flags that once represented empire now represented aspiration. Negotiations replaced commands. Settlements that had once grown under British direction now looked toward self-governance. The age of settlement slowed. Territories that had been shaped by migration and expansion began to redefine themselves. Some moved through protest and political struggle. Still others navigated identity quietly, changing through education and generational shift. The idea that the future would continue to follow imperial lines faded into memory. For many settlers, the greatest change was internal. They had grown up with a story that described empire as permanent. The wars revealed how quickly the world could change. They had been taught to see Britain as the center of history. The wars showed a world made of many centers. They had believed settlement would continue forever. The wars showed that borders and belonging could be redrawn. By the mid-1940s, the meaning of settlement was no longer expansion. It was reflection. It was rebuilding. It was deciding what identity meant when it was no longer assigned automatically by empire. Those who returned from the wars stepped into a world that required new definitions. They stood in places built by earlier generations and saw futures that pointed in different directions. The question was no longer how far the empire would grow. It was how far these communities would go on their own. Revolution, reform, and independence movements rose not because the empire collapsed suddenly, but because the world wars ended the belief that empire was permanent. After 1945, everything that followed became a continuation of that realization. From 1914 to 1945, settlers left home to fight for Britain. When they returned, they found themselves fighting for something different. A place in the world that belonged to them alone. The age of settlement turned into the age of return. The age of return became the age of decision. And the age of decision shaped the history that came after. The end of the settler empire 1947 to 1950. Between 1947 and 1950, the world entered a moment of historical realignment. The age of the settler empire, built over generations through migration, agriculture, administration, and distant settlement, began to dissolve. In 1947, India gained independence, and the shock of that moment moved outward like a tide. Other colonies followed with declarations, negotiations, and transitions that signaled the end of a structure once believed to be permanent. The settlers who had crossed oceans in the 19th century to build new societies now lived in countries reshaping themselves. Some stayed. Some left. All carried memories of a world that no longer existed as it once had. Families who had lived abroad for decades faced decisions that touched every part of their identity. For some, their children had been born overseas. They spoke with accents shaped by landscapes far from Britain. They attended schools built from British systems but influenced by local culture. They ate food that blended imported tradition with regional flavor. These families considered their place not as temporary, but as home. Independence did not undo their years of life. It simply changed the context around them. Others felt the pull to return to Britain. They packed trunks with heirlooms, photographs, and keepsakes collected across continents. Some brought back carved furniture, textiles, or metalwork that held the memory of places and people they had known. Their return voyages mirrored the journeys of their ancestors, but the direction had reversed. They arrived not as settlers seeking land, but as former settlers seeking familiarity. Britain, however, was not the same place they remembered. Streets were crowded, economies strained by post-war reconstruction, and the empire was no longer the anchor of identity. In Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, independence did not create abrupt departure. It created distance. These countries had long developed their own governments, institutions, and political cultures. Their settler histories did not disappear with the end of imperial authority. Instead, they became national stories. They formed the roots of new identities separate from Britain. The settlers who remained became citizens of nations that no longer looked to London for instruction. They stayed not as representatives of an empire, but as participants in sovereign states. For those who returned to Britain, memory became the bridge between worlds. They described sunlit coasts, wide farmland, and the feeling of belonging to two places at once. They carried stories of neighbors, friends, and markets that could not be found in British towns. They spoke of the weight of distance and the way a landscape could shape a person. Their memories were not simply nostalgic. They were evidence of how deeply settlement had influenced individuals as well as nations. The end of the settler empire also brought questions. What had settlement meant for those who lived in these lands before British arrival? How had culture changed in ways that were not always visible from abroad? These questions did not erase the past, but they reframed it. They revealed that settlement had not been a single narrative. It had been many, overlapping and complex. To some settlers, their journey had been a search for opportunity. To others, it had been an escape from poverty. To those whose lands they entered, it had been a disruption, a transformation, or a struggle. As independence movements progressed, the language surrounding empire changed. Politicians spoke of partnership and cooperation rather than rule. Public ceremonies shifted focus. Instead of celebrating imperial milestones, they acknowledged national ones. New flags rose. New anthems were sung. New leaders stepped forward. The world did not collapse. It rearranged itself. Between 1947 and 1950, ordinary life reflected this new world. In Britain, migration began to flow in both directions. Former colonies sent doctors, engineers, students, and workers seeking opportunity in the country that had once governed theirs. New communities formed in British cities, changing neighborhoods through culture, language, and daily routine. The legacy of settlement now moved inward, shaping Britain itself. The empire that once sent people outward now received them in return. Meanwhile, abroad, the descendants of settlers made choices about their identities. Some continued to identify closely with Britain, preserving customs, traditions, and language. Others identified wholly with the countries of their birth, seeing themselves not as branches of a former empire, but as citizens of independent nations. Over time, the weight of imperial memory softened. It did not vanish. It simply became part of the foundation rather than the structure. In Parliament, debates reflected the end of the settler empire as both a political and emotional shift. Some representatives argued that Britain must redefine itself without reliance on overseas territory. Others feared the nation was shrinking in influence. But behind every speech was the same truth. The empire had ended not only because colonies sought independence, but because the world had changed around it. Technology, communication, war, and reconstruction had created conditions that made old systems unsustainable. The years 1947 to 1950 formed a threshold. On one side stood the world shaped by settlement, expansion, and certainty. Settlement had changed nations. It had built cities, rewritten landscapes, and introduced new forms of governance. It had changed cultures, blending traditions into identities that could not be separated into before and after. It had changed history, not through a single moment, but through generations of movement, labor, belief, and adaptation. Neither erased the other. They existed together, like two layers of history visible at once. By 1950, the settler empire was no longer a force that directed the world. It was a subject to be studied, remembered, questioned, and understood. Its story continued, not in borders, but in people. In accents, in architecture, in family histories, and in memory. The empire ended. The influence remained. Thank you for joining this journey through time. Britannia's overseas settlers were not just travelers. They were builders, dreamers, survivors, and sometimes instruments of empire. They changed Britain. They changed the world. And the world changed them in return. Empires rise. Empires fall. But the stories of those who crossed oceans remain. Until next time, take care, stay curious, and keep learning from the past.